Tonight, we travel to the very heart of Bloodborne's tragedy, to an event so terrible that its consequences echo across dimensions, trapping the guilty in an eternal nightmare of punishment and despair. We're going to spend the next few hours uncovering the full story of the Fishing Hamlet Massacre, the original sin that set into motion everything that would eventually consume Yharnam in blood and fire. This is a story of ambition and cruelty, of scholars who saw themselves as enlightened seekers of truth, but committed atrocities that would haunt them beyond death itself. It's a story of a goddess who washed ashore, only to be butchered in the name of progress, of villagers transformed into monsters by the very people who should have protected them, and of a hunter named Maria, whose guilt became so overwhelming that she threw away her weapon and waited for death at the bottom of a clock tower. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into Bloodborne's darkest chapter. Chapter 1. The Scholars of Byrgenwerth. Long before the healing church rose to power, long before the beast scourge consumed Yharnam's streets, there existed a place of learning nestled on the shores of a vast underground lake. This was Byrgenwerth, and it was here that humanity first reached out to touch the divine, not knowing that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The College of Byrgenwerth stood as a monument to human curiosity. Its weathered stone buildings had watched over generations of scholars who came seeking knowledge in all its forms: natural philosophy, alchemy, medicine, astronomy. The students who walked these halls pursued truth with a fervor that bordered on the religious. But it was not the movement of stars or the properties of metals that would define Byrgenwerth's legacy. It was what they found beneath their feet that changed everything. Master Willem presided over this institution with an iron will and an insatiable hunger for understanding. He was not a man who accepted limitations easily. Where others saw boundaries, Willem saw challenges to be overcome. Where others counseled caution, Willem pushed forward with the conviction of someone who believed that knowledge itself was the highest good, regardless of the cost. His philosophy was simple and terrifying in its implications. Humanity needed to evolve beyond its current state. The flesh was weak, the mind was limited, and only by transcending these biological shackles could human beings achieve their true potential. The discovery of the Pthumerian labyrinths transformed Willem's philosophy from abstract speculation into practical pursuit. Beneath Yharnam, ancient ruins stretched for miles in every direction, the remnants of a civilization that had achieved things modern scholars could barely comprehend. The Pthumerians had built vast underground cities, developed technologies that seemed like magic, and most importantly, they had made contact with beings from beyond the visible world. The first expeditions into the labyrinth were cautious, exploratory affairs. Small teams descended through hidden entrances, mapping corridors and cataloging artifacts. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. The Pthumerian civilization had existed for thousands of years before its mysterious collapse. They had developed architectural techniques that allowed them to construct chambers of impossible scale, supported by principles that seemed to defy everything modern engineers understood about load-bearing structures. They had created tools and weapons that incorporated materials unknown to surface chemistry, and everywhere, carved into walls and etched onto artifacts, were symbols and images that depicted beings utterly unlike anything in the natural world, the Great Ones. The scholars gave them this name almost immediately, recognizing in the Pthumerian representations something that demanded reverence even as it inspired terror. These were not simple gods or spirits of the sort worshipped by primitive cultures. They were entities that existed on scales of space and time that dwarfed human comprehension. Their bodies, when they possessed bodies at all, operated according to biological principles that made no sense under normal physical law. Their minds, if mind was even the right word, perceived realities that overlapped with human experience without being contained by it. The Pthumerians had sought communion with these beings. Their civilization had been built around this quest, their technologies developed specifically to facilitate contact with cosmic intelligence. The labyrinth itself was not merely a city or a tomb. It was a temple, a vast machine designed to create conditions under which human and cosmic consciousness could interact. The deeper chambers showed evidence of rituals conducted over countless generations, attempts to bridge the gap between mortal understanding and transcendent awareness. Some of these attempts had clearly succeeded. The records left behind by Pthumerian scholars described moments of contact, flashes of insight that revealed truths about the nature of existence that could not have been discovered through ordinary investigation. They wrote of visions that showed the universe from perspectives outside human comprehension. They spoke of gifts received from cosmic benefactors, knowledge and power granted to those deemed worthy of such elevation. But the records also described failures. Many who attempted communion with the Great Ones emerged broken, their minds shattered by exposure to realities they could not process. Others were changed in ways that rendered them unrecognizable, their bodies transformed to reflect the alien biology of the entities they had contacted. Still others simply vanished, drawn into dimensions from which no return was possible. The Pthumerian civilization had eventually collapsed. The exact cause remained unclear, but the evidence suggested that their quest for cosmic knowledge had ultimately consumed them. The deepest chambers of the labyrinth showed signs of catastrophic damage, as if something tremendous had occurred there in the civilization's final days. The Pthumerian people had disappeared, leaving behind only their ruins and their records as testimony to what they had achieved and what they had lost. Willem saw in this history both a warning and an opportunity. The Pthumerians had proven that communion with Great Ones was possible. They had developed methods for facilitating such contact and documented the results of their experiments. This knowledge was invaluable for anyone seeking to continue their work, but their fate also demonstrated the dangers inherent in such pursuits. The line between transcendence and destruction was thin, and those who walked it needed to do so with extreme care. The old blood, they called it, a mysterious substance discovered in the depths of those ancient tombs. It possessed healing properties, unlike anything the scholars had ever encountered. Wounds that should have been fatal closed in moments. Diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were cured with a single transfusion. It seemed like a miracle, a gift from the universe, to a species that had struggled and suffered since its earliest days. But Willem was not satisfied with mere healing. The old blood represented something far more significant to him. It was proof that higher beings existed, entities whose biology operated according to principles that humanity had never imagined. If such beings existed, Willem reasoned, then surely it was possible for humans to become like them. The Great Ones, as these cosmic entities came to be known, possessed awareness and capabilities that dwarfed human understanding. They saw the universe from perspectives that mortal minds could not even conceive. They existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space, and somewhere in the deepest parts of the labyrinth, evidence suggested that the Pthumerians had achieved some form of communion with these beings. Willem's most famous maxim became the guiding principle of Byrgenwerth's research. We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open. Fear the old blood. This warning would prove prophetic, though not in the way Willem himself understood. He recognized the danger inherent in the blood, even as he sought to exploit its properties. His fear was not that the blood would destroy humanity, but that humanity would use it foolishly, without the wisdom necessary to avoid catastrophe. The provost assembled around him a group of exceptional individuals, each brilliant in their own way, each driven by the same hunger for transcendence that animated Willem himself. These were not ordinary scholars content with incremental discovery. They were pioneers willing to push beyond every conventional boundary in pursuit of ultimate truth. Among these scholars, several names would echo through history with particular significance. Lawrence was perhaps the most brilliant and certainly the most ambitious of Willem's students. His mind grasped concepts that eluded others, and his charisma drew followers to him almost magnetically. But Lawrence was also impatient. He chafed against Willem's caution, believing that his master's warnings about the blood were overly conservative. The blood was a tool, Lawrence argued, and like any tool, it simply needed to be used properly. Then there was Yharnam, a different sort entirely, where Lawrence was all fire and ambition. Yharnam was methodical, practical, deadly. He had come to Byrgenwerth not as a scholar, but as a hunter, someone who could protect the expeditions into the labyrinth from the dangers that lurked in those ancient depths. Over time, however, Yharnam had become something more than a simple protector. Willem recognized his unique capabilities and began to employ him in tasks that required a combination of skill, discretion, and moral flexibility. Yharnam was a weapon, and Willem was not above using him as such. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower stood apart from the other members of Willem's inner circle. Descended from the noble line of Cainhurst, she carried within her veins blood that traced back to an ancient and mysterious heritage. The vile bloods of Cainhurst had their own relationship with the blood, one that the scholars of Byrgenwerth viewed with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Maria herself seemed unconcerned with her lineage. She had left Cainhurst behind, rejecting the decadence and bloodlust that characterized her homeland in favor of what she saw as a purer pursuit of truth. Maria trained under Yharnam, learning the arts of combat that would make her one of the most formidable hunters who ever lived. Her speed was legendary, her blade work poetry in motion, but it was not just her physical prowess that set Maria apart. She possessed an intelligence and sensitivity that made her uniquely valuable to the Byrgenwerth expedition. Where others saw only specimens to be studied, Maria sometimes glimpsed something more. A flicker of consciousness in a cosmic entity's eye. A moment of what might have been emotion in a being supposedly beyond such things. These observations would prove both her greatest contribution and the source of her eventual undoing. The expeditions into the labyrinth had yielded tremendous results. The scholars had recovered artifacts of incredible power, documented creatures that defied natural law, and accumulated knowledge that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. But Willem wanted more. The labyrinth was vast, but it was also finite. The Pthumerians who had built it were long dead, their civilization reduced to ruins and echoes. If humanity was truly to transcend its limitations, new sources of cosmic knowledge needed to be found. It was at this crucial juncture that word reached Byrgenwerth of a strange occurrence along the coast. Fishermen had been telling tales for generations of unusual catches and stranger sightings in the waters near a remote hamlet. Most scholars dismissed these stories as superstition, the product of simple minds trying to explain the natural mysteries of the sea. But Willem recognized something in these accounts that others had missed. The descriptions matched patterns he had observed in the labyrinth. The cosmic entities that the Pthumerians had contacted were not confined to underground tombs. They moved through dimensions that intersected with the physical world in unpredictable ways. Sometimes, it seemed, they washed ashore. The decision to investigate the fishing hamlet would alter the course of human history. In that moment, standing in his study, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of years of research, Willem could not have known what his scholars would find on that distant shore. He could not have known that their actions would create a nightmare that would persist for centuries. He knew only that here was an opportunity, a chance to encounter something truly cosmic, without the dangers and limitations of the labyrinth expeditions. The hamlet was accessible, the locals were primitive and easily managed, and whatever had drawn the attention of the Great Ones to this place demanded investigation. Willem assembled his team with care. Lawrence would lead the scholarly component of the expedition, his brilliance essential for interpreting whatever they might find. Gaiman would provide security and handle any complications that might arise. Maria would serve as liaison and observer, her sensitivity to cosmic resonance potentially valuable in making contact with whatever awaited them. Others would accompany them, hunters and scholars whose names history would not record, but whose actions would be judged for all eternity. The expedition departed Byrgenwerth on a grey morning, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the earth. Maria later recalled that she had felt a strange unease as they left the college grounds, a sensation like being watched by something vast and invisible. she had dismissed the feeling as nerves. She would spend the rest of her existence wishing she had listened to that warning. Chapter 2. The Hamlet. By the sea. The fishing hamlet occupied a stretch of rocky coastline where the land seemed to dissolve into the ocean. There was no clear boundary between shore and sea here, just an endless transition of tide pools, submerged rocks, and channels of brackish water that wound between weathered cottages like the veins of some great slumbering beast. The village had existed for longer than anyone could remember, passed down through generations of families who made their living from the sea's bounty. The people of the hamlet were not like the residents of Yharnam or the scholars of Byrgenwerth. They had developed their own ways over centuries of isolation, traditions and practices that seemed strange to outsiders, but made perfect sense to those who understood the rhythms of ocean life. They spoke in an accent that was nearly incomprehensible to visitors from the cities. They marked time not by calendars, but by the cycles of the tides. They worshipped not in churches, but on the shore itself, offering prayers to the sea and whatever mysteries it contained. Their fishing techniques had been refined over countless generations, passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain of practical wisdom. They knew which waters held the best catches, at which times of year. They could read the weather in cloud patterns that meant nothing to outsiders. They understood the moods of the sea, its moments of generosity, and its periods of withdrawal, in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those who had not grown up, surrounded by salt spray and the constant rhythm of waves. The hamlet's architecture reflected its relationship with the ocean. The cottages were built low to the ground, designed to withstand the powerful storms that periodically swept in from the sea. Their roofs were weighted with stones, and their foundations extended deep into the rocky soil. The village streets, such as they were, followed the natural contours of the coastline, rather than any geometric plan. Everything bent to accommodate the environment rather than attempting to impose order upon it. The social structure of the community was equally organic. There were no formal titles or hierarchies. Leadership emerged naturally from respect earned through skill, wisdom, and service to the community. The elders who guided important decisions did so not through any official authority, but because their neighbors trusted their judgment. Disputes were resolved through consensus and compromise rather than imposed verdicts. The hamlet has survived for centuries without the institutions that other communities considered essential, sustained by bonds of kinship and mutual dependence that proved stronger than any law. Their religious practices had evolved in similar fashion. The sea was sacred to them, as it was to many coastal peoples, but their devotion went beyond simple respect for a powerful natural force. They believed that the ocean contained mysteries that transcended ordinary understanding, realms and beings that existed alongside the physical world without being fully part of it. Their rituals were designed to honor these mysteries and maintain favorable relations with whatever powers dwelt beneath the waves. These beliefs were not mere superstition. The villagers had observed too many inexplicable phenomena over the generations to dismiss the possibility of supernatural forces at work in their waters. Schools of fish that appeared from nowhere at moments of desperate need, storms that seemed to respond to prayers, turning aside from the hamlet when they threatened destruction, catches that included creatures unlike anything recorded in any naturalist catalogue. The sea gave and the sea took, but it did so in patterns that suggested conscious decision rather than random chance. Most travelers who encountered the hamlet gave it wide berth. The villagers were not unfriendly exactly, but they made it clear that outsiders were not welcome to stay long. Their reluctance to engage with the wider world had earned them a reputation for being primitive, backward, perhaps even touched by something unwholesome. Rumors circulated about strange ceremonies conducted under the light of the full moon. Fishermen from other villages told stories of catching glimpses of the hamlet's residents, engaged in activities that seemed more ritual than practical, more worship than work. The truth about the fishing hamlet was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than these rumors suggested. The villagers had indeed developed a religious tradition centered on the sea, but this was hardly unusual for a community whose survival depended entirely on what the waters provided. What made them different was what the sea had actually provided them. Generations before the Byrgenwerth scholars arrived, something had happened in the waters near the hamlet. The oldest residents spoke of it, only in whispers, passing the story down through family lines, like a sacred trust. Something had come from the depths, they said. Something vast and ancient, and utterly unlike anything the fishermen had ever encountered. It had not attacked them or demanded tribute. Instead, it had simply appeared, floating in the shallows like a mountain of pale flesh, and the villagers had understood immediately that they were in the presence of something holy. They called her Kos. The Great One who came to rest on their shores was unlike the cosmic entities that haunted the Pthumerian labyrinth, where those beings were often hostile or indifferent to human presence. Kos seemed to radiate something that the villagers interpreted as benevolence. Under her influence, the fishing catches improved dramatically. Diseases that had plagued the hamlet for years disappeared. Children who had been sickly grew strong. It was as if her very presence blessed the village with a portion of her cosmic vitality. The villagers responded to this gift with reverence. They built shrines in her honor, decorated with shells and driftwood and the bones of fish. They developed ceremonies designed to express their gratitude and maintain the connection they felt with their divine visitor. Over time, these practices evolved into something more intimate. Some villagers began to undergo physical changes, subtle alterations that brought them closer to the sea, and they believed, closer to Kos herself. These transformations were not seen as corruption by the hamlet's residents. They were badges of honor, signs of Kos's favor. The fish-like features that appeared on some faces, the webbing between fingers, strange luminescence that certain individuals developed in their eyes, all of these were understood as blessings rather than curses. The villagers had not become less human in their own view. They had become more, touched by divinity in ways that ordinary people could not comprehend. By the time the Byrgenwerth expedition arrived, several generations had passed since Kos first appeared. The Great One herself had retreated from the shallows, her massive form descending into deeper waters, where the villagers could no longer see her directly. But her influence remained palpable. The hamlet had become a place where the boundary between the physical world and cosmic reality had grown thin, where things that should have been impossible occurred with regularity, where the laws of nature bent in subtle but unmistakable ways. The scholars from Byrgenwerth recognized the signs immediately. This was what they had been seeking, a living connection to the Great Ones that did not require descending into the dangers of the labyrinth. The villagers themselves were subjects of tremendous interest, their physical changes providing evidence of cosmic influence operating on human biology in real time. But it was the presence they sensed in the waters, that vast intelligence lurking just beyond perception, that truly excited the expedition. Lawrence was the first to articulate what they had found. This hamlet, he wrote in his initial reports, represents an unprecedented opportunity. The population has achieved a degree of communion with a Great One that surpasses anything documented in the Pthumerian records. Their physical transformations suggest that cosmic evolution can be guided, accelerated, perhaps even controlled. If we can understand the mechanism by which Kos has blessed these simple fishermen, we may finally unlock the secret to human transcendence. The villagers welcomed the scholars initially. They had little experience with outsiders and assumed that anyone who showed interest in Kos must share their reverence for the Great One. They showed the Byrgenwerth team their shrines, explained their ceremonies, and even allowed some of the scholars to participate in their rituals. Maria found herself moved by the genuine devotion these simple people displayed. Whatever else might be said about their strange beliefs and unusual appearances, there was no denying the authenticity of their faith. Gaiman saw the situation differently. To his practical eye, the villagers represented both an asset and a potential problem. They possessed knowledge about Kos that could prove invaluable, but they were also fiercely protective of their way of life. If the research required methods that the villagers found objectionable, their cooperation could not be relied upon. Gaiman began to make quiet preparations for scenarios in which cooperation would no longer be necessary. The initial phase of the expedition focused on documentation and observation. The scholars mapped the hamlet, and its surroundings, catalogued the physical variations among the villagers, collected samples of the unusual marine life that thrived in these waters. They interviewed residents about their history and traditions, piecing together the story of Kos's arrival and the changes that followed. Everything was conducted with at least a pretense of respect and collaboration. But as the weeks passed, the nature of the research began to shift. The scholars grew frustrated with the limitations of mere observation. They wanted to understand the mechanisms of cosmic transformation, not just document its result. They began to request more invasive access, asking to examine villagers more closely, to collect tissue samples, to study the more dramatic transformations that some residents had undergone. The villagers, sensing that something had changed, began to resist. It was during this period that the expedition received word that would transform their entire mission. One of the villagers, either through genuine devotion or under pressure from the increasingly demanding scholars, revealed that Kos was no longer merely lurking in the depths. She had returned to the shallows, her enormous form visible just beneath the surface of the water. More significantly, she was pregnant. The implications of this revelation were staggering. A great one capable of reproduction represented something the scholars had never encountered. The children of cosmic entities were theoretically documented in the Sumerian records, but these were fragmentary accounts, more legend than scholarship. Here was an opportunity to observe, perhaps even to participate in, the birth of a being that bridged the gap between humanity and the divine. Lawrence's excitement was barely contained. He immediately dispatched messages to Willem at Byrgenwerth, requesting additional resources and personnel. The original mission parameters, he argued, were no longer adequate. They had stumbled upon something that could redefine everything they understood about the Great Ones and their relationship to humanity. Whatever actions were necessary to study this cosmic pregnancy must be undertaken without hesitation. Willem's response, when it came, was characteristically measured but ultimately supportive. The provost shared his students' excitement while cautioning against reckless action. The Great Ones were not to be trifled with, he reminded Lawrence. Whatever was done must be done carefully, methodically, with full appreciation for the risks involved. But Willem also recognized that opportunities like this came along once in a generation. If that, he authorized Lawrence to proceed as he saw fit, trusting his most brilliant student to balance ambition with prudence. It was a trust that would prove catastrophically misplaced. Chapter 3. The Mother of the Cosmos. Kos presented a sight that defied human comprehension. She floated in the shallows near the hamlet, her enormous body partially visible through the grey-green water. The scholars who first glimpsed her struggled to describe what they saw. She was vaguely reminiscent of marine life, possessing features that suggested both mollusks and crustaceans, but arranged in configurations that followed no natural precedent. Her flesh was pale, almost luminescent, and seemed to shift subtly even when she remained perfectly still. Appendages of uncertain function extended from her bulk at irregular intervals, and everywhere, covering nearly every visible surface, were eyes. The eyes of Kos did not blink. They did not focus on individual observers or track movement in any conventional sense. They simply saw, taking in everything around them with an awareness that the scholars could only dimly comprehend. Looking at those eyes, even from a distance, produced an uncomfortable sensation of being perceived, not just visually, but existentially. Kos saw you, and in seeing you, she understood things about you that you did not understand about yourself. The scholars documented everything they could about Kos's physical form. They estimated her length at approximately 60 feet, though the constant motion of water made precise measurement difficult. Her mass was incalculable, given that significant portions of her body remained submerged even in the shallows. The appendages ranged from tentacle-like extensions to rigid protrusions that might have served as feeding mechanisms or sensory organs. Nothing in their anatomical training had prepared them for a creature that so thoroughly violated every principle of biological organization. They attempted to sketch her, to capture some visual record of what they observed, but the drawings never quite matched what they saw. Something about Kos's form resisted two-dimensional representation. Artists, who prided themselves on their ability to render complex subjects accurately, found their sketches producing results that seemed wrong in ways they could not articulate. The angles did not connect properly, the proportions shifted depending on the lighting. It was as if Kos existed in more dimensions than human perception could access, with only a portion of her true form intersecting the visible world. The sounds Kos produced were equally difficult to document. At times she emitted low, sustained tones that could be felt more than heard, vibrations that traveled through the water and up through the shore into the observers' bodies. At other times she was perfectly silent, her massive form drifting with the currents, without producing any acoustic signature. Occasionally, especially when the villagers approached with offerings, she generated complex patterns of sound that might have been communication or might have been something else entirely. The scholars theorized that these vocalizations operated on frequencies beyond normal human hearing. Some reported experiencing physical sensations during particularly intense periods of Kos's activity, feelings of pressure or disorientation that had no obvious cause. Others described emotional states that seemed disconnected from their circumstances, moments of profound sadness or inexplicable joy that passed as quickly as they arrived. Whether these effects were intentional communications from Kos or simply side effects of proximity to a cosmic entity remained unclear. The villagers' ability to coexist with Kos suggested that adaptation to cosmic presence was possible. Their generations of exposure had apparently granted them a degree of immunity to the more disturbing effects of her proximity, or perhaps their transformations, the fish-like features that distinguished them from ordinary humans, had altered their perceptual apparatus in ways that made cosmic contact less traumatic. Either interpretation carried significant implications for the scholars' research into human transcendence. Despite her alien appearance, the villagers approached Kos without fear. They had lived in her presence for generations, and her periodic returns to the shallows were celebrated events. They brought offerings of fish and shells, placing them in the water near her immense form, and singing songs that had been passed down through their families since time immemorial. To them, she was not a monster or even an object of terror. She was a goddess who had chosen to bless their humble community with her presence. The scholars observed these interactions with intense interest. The relationship between Kos and her worshippers demonstrated something unprecedented, a great one who actively engaged with humans rather than ignoring or destroying them. The villagers seemed to derive genuine benefit from this relationship, their transformations notwithstanding. Some scholars began to speculate that the cosmic entities might not be as uniformly indifferent to humanity as the Thumerian records suggested. Perhaps, under the right circumstances, a productive partnership was possible. Lady Maria found herself drawn to Kos in ways she struggled to articulate. Watching the villagers interact with their goddess, she felt a strange sense of kinship with both parties. Her Cainhurst blood carried its own connections to powers beyond human understanding, and something about Kos's presence resonated with those dormant aspects of her heritage. Maria began to spend hours on the shore, simply observing, trying to understand the nature of the bond between the Great One and her followers. It was during one of these observation sessions that Maria made the discovery that would change everything. She noticed that Kos's behavior had shifted over the past several days. The Great One, usually calm to the point of seeming torpid, had begun to move restlessly in the shallows. The eyes that covered her body seemed to pulse with an inner light, and occasionally, sounds emerged from somewhere within her bulk, deep reverberations that were felt as much as heard. Maria reported her observations to Lawrence, who immediately grasped their significance. Kos was experiencing the cosmic equivalent of labor. The child she carried was preparing to be born. The expedition went into overdrive. Every scholar was mobilized to observe and document the birth. Instruments were set up along the shore to measure whatever could be measured. The hunters took up positions around the hamlet, ostensibly to protect the researchers, but also to ensure that the villagers did not interfere with whatever might follow. No one slept, no one ate. Every eye was fixed on the waters, where Kos labored to bring forth new life. The birth itself lasted for 3 days. During this time, reality in and around the hamlet seemed to lose coherence. Time flowed strangely, with minutes stretching into hours and hours compressing into moments. The sky cycled through colors that had no names, and the sea itself seemed to breathe in synchronization with Kos's efforts. The scholars documented everything they could, filling page after page with observations that would later prove indecipherable to those who had not witnessed the events firsthand. On the morning of the third day, Kos went still. The constant motion that had characterized her labor ceased entirely, and for a moment, the scholars feared that something had gone wrong. Then, with a sound like the world exhaling, the child emerged. The orphan, as it would come to be known, bore little resemblance to its mother. Where Kos was vast and relatively formless, the orphan possessed a humanoid configuration. Where Kos was pale and luminescent, the orphan's skin was mottled and dark, glistening with fluids that did not resemble any terrestrial birth matter. It emerged from Kos screaming, a sound that bypassed the ears and penetrated directly into the consciousness of every living thing within range. The villagers fell to their knees, weeping with what appeared to be joy. To them, this was the culmination of everything their ancestors had worked toward. The child of Kos represented a new chapter in their relationship with the divine, proof that their devotion had been rewarded with the most sacred blessing imaginable. They began to sing, their voices rising to meet the orphan's cries in a strange and terrible harmony. The scholars' reaction was considerably more complex. The birth of a great one was exactly what they had hoped to witness, but the reality of the event exceeded their capacity to process. Several researchers had to be restrained as they attempted to approach the newborn entity. Others simply collapsed, their minds unable to reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of how the universe worked. Only the hunters maintained their composure, their training having prepared them to function even in the face of cosmic horror. Lawrence alone seemed energized rather than overwhelmed by the spectacle. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that Maria found unsettling as he watched the orphan take its first breaths of earthly air. "Here," he declared to those near enough to hear, "is our future. Here is the proof that cosmic evolution is achievable, that humanity need not remain trapped in biological mediocrity. We must study this creature, we must understand how it was created, and then we must replicate the process." The words sent a chill through Maria, despite the excitement of the moment. There was something in Lawrence's tone that suggested he was no longer thinking of the orphan as a being in its own right, but as a specimen, a resource to be exploited. She tried to convince herself that she was misinterpreting his meaning, but the stress of the past 3 days was causing her to imagine threats that did not exist. But deep down, she knew that something had shifted in the expedition's purpose, and she feared what that shift might mean. Her fears would prove tragically prophetic. Chapter 4. The Descent into Madness. In the days following the orphan's birth, the dynamics of the expedition underwent a fundamental transformation. The scholars had come to the hamlet, seeking knowledge about the Great Ones. Now, with unprecedented access to a cosmic entity and its newborn child, their ambitions expanded exponentially. Documentation was no longer sufficient. Understanding was not enough. They wanted samples. The initial requests seemed almost reasonable. Tissue samples from Kos, carefully collected, analysis of the fluids that still clung to the orphan's flesh, examination of the environmental changes that the birth had produced in the surrounding area. These were the methods of science, the scholars told themselves. They were simply doing what any rational researcher would do when confronted with such extraordinary subjects. The procedures for collecting samples were developed with meticulous care. Specialized tools were fashioned from materials brought from Byrgenwerth, designed to penetrate flesh that might resist ordinary instruments. Preservation techniques were prepared to maintain the integrity of any tissues extracted. Recording protocols ensured that every step of the process would be documented for later analysis. The first attempts to obtain samples from Kos were conducted with something approaching reverence. A single researcher, chosen for steady hands and scientific objectivity, approached the Great One's partially submerged form, while colleagues maintained careful observation from the shore. The procedure was intended to be minimally invasive, a small incision to extract a portion of tissue from what appeared to be a non-vital region of Kos's anatomy. What happened next revealed how little the scholars understood about the being they were studying. The moment the blade touched Kos's flesh, a wave of psychic force radiated outward from her body. The researcher who had made contact collapsed immediately, his mind overwhelmed by something that defied description. Those on shore experienced the effect at reduced intensity, but were still staggered by its impact. When the researcher was recovered and revived, he could barely speak. He described seeing things, visions of cosmic scales that his consciousness could not process. He had glimpsed, for a fraction of a second, something of how Kos perceived existence. The experience had nearly destroyed him. It took days before he could function normally again, and even then, he was never quite the same. But the scholars did not interpret this event as a warning. They saw it as evidence of Kos's extraordinary properties, proof that contact with Great One biology produced effects that transcended normal physical interaction. If even touching Kos's flesh could grant cosmic insight, imagine what might be achieved through more systematic study. The potential seemed unlimited. Subsequent procedures were conducted with protective measures in place. Researchers developed techniques to shield themselves from the psychic emissions that Kos produced when disturbed. They discovered that certain preparations could mitigate the worst effects of cosmic contact, though they could not eliminate them entirely. With these protections, they were able to extract larger samples and subject Kos to more invasive examinations. But the Great Ones were not ordinary subjects, and the methods that worked for studying terrestrial biology proved woefully inadequate for cosmic investigation. The samples collected from Kos yielded nothing useful when examined with conventional instruments. The fluids from the birth defied chemical analysis, their composition seeming to change depending on who examined them and when. Frustration mounted as the scholars realized that their tools and techniques were simply not suited to the task at hand. Lawrence's response to this frustration was to escalate. If careful methods produced no results, then more aggressive approaches were required. He authorized procedures that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Cutting into Kos to extract deeper tissue samples, probing the orphan with instruments designed to measure cosmic energy, experimenting on the villagers whose transformations might hold clues to the mechanisms of cosmic influence. The villagers' cooperation, already strained, collapsed entirely. They had tolerated the scholars' presence because they believed the outsiders shared their reverence for Kos. Now, watching the researchers mutilate their goddess in the name of science, they realized they had made a terrible mistake. Protests began, first verbal and then physical. Several villagers attempted to block the scholars from reaching Kos. Others tried to smuggle information about what was happening to the outside world. Gehrman suppressed these rebellions with efficient brutality. The hunters who had accompanied the expedition were no longer merely security personnel. They became jailers, enforcers, executioners. When necessary, villagers who resisted too strenuously were made to disappear. Those who remained were confined to their homes, emerging only when the scholars required their participation in experiments. Maria watched these developments with growing horror. She had joined the expedition, believing in its noble purpose, convinced that the pursuit of knowledge would ultimately benefit humanity. What she witnessed now bore no resemblance to the enlightened research she had imagined. This was violation, pure and simple. They were tormenting beings that had done nothing to deserve such treatment, desecrating a deity in the eyes of her devoted followers, transforming a sacred place into a charnel house. She tried to voice her concerns to Lawrence, to make him see that they had crossed lines that should never be crossed. He listened to her words with the patient condescension of someone who has already made up his mind. "Maria," he said, "I understand your discomfort. These methods are distasteful, but you must understand what is at stake. The knowledge we gain here will transform human existence. The suffering of a few villagers, even the discomfort of a cosmic entity, is a small price to pay for such transcendence. History will vindicate us." The words offered no comfort. Maria found herself unable to participate in the ongoing experiments, retreating to the edges of the hamlet, where she could avoid witnessing the worst of what was happening. But avoidance was not the same as resistance. She remained with the expedition, still loyal to Yharnam, if not to Lawrence, still hoping that somehow things would change before they went too far. Things did not change. They got worse. The scholars discovered that Kos's flesh, when properly prepared, could be consumed by humans with remarkable effects. The substance granted visions, insights into cosmic truths that no amount of study could provide. It also granted power, temporary abilities that defied natural law. Several researchers began ingesting small amounts, reporting experiences that left them transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Lawrence saw in this discovery the key to everything he had sought. If consuming the flesh of a great one could grant cosmic insight and ability, then surely the flesh of a great one's child would be even more potent. The orphan, still young and vulnerable, represented the purest possible source of cosmic material. Its tissues would not be diluted by age or contaminated by the environment. It was, in Lawrence's increasingly unhinged reasoning, the perfect specimen. The decision to vivisect the orphan was not made lightly, but it was made. Some scholars objected, arguing that destroying such a unique creature violated every principle of responsible research. Others simply could not stomach the prospect of what such a procedure would entail. But Lawrence had accumulated enough support among those who shared his ambition and enough leverage over those who did not. The dissenters were silenced or removed. The preparations began. Maria learned of the plan through Yharnam, who informed her with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe a routine security operation. The hunters would secure the area around Kos, ensuring that neither the Great One nor the villagers could interfere. The scholars would perform the procedure on the orphan while it remained close to its mother, unable to flee. Everything would be documented for later analysis. The final words of this briefing pushed Maria over a line she had not known existed within her. She had endured the imprisonment of the villagers, the torture of Kos, the steady degradation of everything she believed the expedition stood for. But the murder of a child, even a cosmic child, for the sake of research, struck her as an atrocity beyond any possibility of justification. She confronted Yharnam directly, demanding that he refuse to participate. Yharnam's response revealed depths of his character that Maria had never before perceived. He did not pretend that what they were about to do was right. He did not offer justifications about the greater good or the advancement of Moloch. He simply stated that this was what was required, that he had accepted obligations that transcended his personal feelings, and that he expected Maria to do the same. When she pressed him further, asking how he could live with himself after participating in such horrors, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. "I don't expect to live with myself afterward," he said, "but I will do what must be done, regardless." The procedure took place on a morning that began like any other. Fog hung over the hamlet, muting sounds and obscuring vision. The hunters moved into position, while the villagers, finally realizing what was about to happen, began to scream and wail in their confinement. The scholars prepared their instruments with hands that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. Kos knew. The Great One, who had remained passive throughout the worst of the experiments, suddenly came alive with terrible purpose. Her eyes blazed with an inner fire, and sounds emerged from her bulk that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in the consciousness of everyone present. The scholars hesitated, some of them stumbling backward from the overwhelming force of her attention. But Kos could not move. Her massive body, adapted for existence in the cosmic depths, was effectively beached on the shore. She could not reach the hunters who surrounded her child. She could only watch and scream and The procedure that followed defied simple description. What was done to the Orphan of Kos that day represented a violation not just of life, but of cosmic law itself. The scholars, driven by their hunger for understanding, committed acts that erased any claim they might have had to the title of enlightened seekers of truth. They became butchers, torturers, violators of the sacred, in every sense of the word. Maria did not participate. She stood at the edge of the hamlet, watching from a distance, unable to approach, but equally unable to leave. She heard the orphans' cries, sounds that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her existence. She saw the scholars emerging from the procedure, covered in fluids that no earthly water could wash away. She watched Kos, that vast and ancient being, die of grief as much as from the wounds they had inflicted upon her. When it was over, when the screams had finally stopped and the fog had lifted to reveal the scope of what they had done, Maria felt something inside herself break. Not her sanity, though that too had been damaged. Something deeper, more fundamental. Her sense of herself as a good person, as someone whose actions aligned with her values. That part of her died on the shores of the fishing hamlet, as surely as Kos and her child had died. The expedition's records would later refer to what happened as a research intervention. They would describe the procedures performed on Kos and the orphan in clinical language that obscured the horror of the actual events. They would note the resistance of the local population without mentioning the massacres required to suppress it. The truth was too terrible for official documentation. It could only be recorded in the nightmares of those who had been present, and in the curse that Kos pronounced with her dying breath. Chapter 5. The Curse of the Mother. As Kos expired on the shores of her adopted home, something happened that none of the scholars had anticipated. The Great One, in her final moments, reached out with a consciousness that transcended death itself. She touched the minds of every hunter and scholar who had participated in the atrocities, and she left behind something that could never be removed. The curse was not immediately apparent. In the days following the massacre, the survivors of the expedition busied themselves with cataloguing their findings and preparing to return to Byrgenwerth. They had obtained what they came for, and more. Samples from Kos and her offspring, documentation of cosmic biology in unprecedented detail, evidence that would justify every action taken, or so they believed. There was even talk of celebration, of the honors and recognition that would surely follow their return to civilization. The expedition members packed their equipment and organized their notes with the methodical efficiency that had characterized their scholarly work. The samples they had extracted were preserved using the best techniques available, sealed in containers designed to maintain their integrity during the journey back to Byrgenwerth. The records they had compiled filled volumes, documenting every observation, every procedure, every result obtained during their time at the hamlet. Some members of the expedition expressed unease about leaving the hamlet in its current state. The village had been effectively destroyed, its population either dead, imprisoned, or transformed beyond recognition. The bodies of those killed during the suppression of resistance remained where they had fallen. The shore where Kos had died was stained with fluids that no natural process would ever wash away. Anyone who came to this place in future would find evidence of what had occurred. Lawrence dismissed these concerns with characteristic pragmatism. The hamlet was remote, he pointed out, known only to the few merchants and travelers who passed this way. The villagers had no connections to the outside world that might prompt investigation, and even if someone did stumble upon the scene, what would they conclude? That some tragedy had befallen an isolated fishing community. Such things happened regularly enough that no one would look too deeply for explanation. But something was wrong. The hunters began to notice it first. Sleep, which had always come easily to those trained to face horrors without flinching, became elusive and disturbed. When they did manage to drift off, their dreams were invaded by images of the hamlet, of Kos's dying eyes, of the orphan's screams. They woke in cold sweats, reaching for weapons that were not there, fighting enemies that existed only in memory. The dreams intensified with each passing night. What began as fragments, disconnected images, and sensations coalesced into coherent narratives. The expedition members found themselves reliving the massacre in their sleep, experiencing events from perspectives they had not occupied during the actual occurrence. A hunter who had remained on the perimeter found himself dreaming of the procedures conducted on Kos. A scholar who had focused on documentation dreamed of fighting through crowds of panicked villagers. These shifted perspectives carried the implicit judgment of the curse. The expedition members were being forced to experience their crimes from the point of view of their victims. They felt the terror of villagers watching their community destroyed by invaders. They shared Kos's agony as her body was violated by instruments designed to extract her deepest secrets. They knew the orphan's helpless confusion as it emerged into a world that immediately set upon it with knives and tools. The scholars experienced similar symptoms, though they were slower to recognize them. Their minds, so disciplined in waking life, became ungovernable in sleep. They dreamed of the procedures they had performed, but in these nightmares, the roles were reversed. They were the ones strapped to tables. They were the ones being cut and probed and violated. Kos watched them with those terrible all-seeing eyes, and her voice whispered truths they desperately wished they could forget. Some expedition members attempted to treat these symptoms as ordinary psychological disturbance. They applied the techniques that had helped them cope with the horrors of labyrinth exploration, rituals of mental discipline designed to compartmentalize traumatic experiences. These techniques, effective against ordinary nightmares, proved useless against Kos's curse. The dreams continued regardless of any conscious effort to suppress them. Yharnam, practical as always, initially dismissed these phenomena as natural consequences of stress and trauma. They had witnessed and participated in events that pushed the boundaries of human experience. Of course, their psyches would require time to process what had occurred. He prescribed rest and routine, confident that the symptoms would fade as the expedition members returned to normal life. The symptoms did not fade, they intensified. The dreams began to bleed into waking consciousness. Scholars reported seeing glimpses of the hamlet in their peripheral vision, phantom images that vanished when viewed directly. Hunters found themselves reliving moments of the massacre at random intervals, their bodies blazoned in place as their minds transported them back to the shore. Some began to hear voices, whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues, carrying messages that seemed to come from vast distances and unimaginable depths. Maria suffered as acutely as any of them, though her torment took a different form. She did not dream of being victimized or relive the violence she had witnessed. Instead, she dreamed of standing on that shore forever, watching the atrocities unfold again and again, unable to intervene, no matter how desperately she tried. In these dreams, she would try to cry out, to warn the villagers, to stop her companions from their terrible work. But no sound emerged from her throat, and her limbs would not obey her commands. She was condemned to witness, endlessly, the horror she had failed to prevent. The return journey to Byrgenwerth became a nightmare in its own right. The expedition members, once united by shared purpose, began to fracture along lines of guilt and blame. Accusations flew between scholars and hunters. Old alliances dissolved as individuals sought to distance themselves from those they held responsible for what had happened. By the time they reached the college, the group that had departed as a coherent research team had become a collection of broken individuals, each drowning in their own private hell. Master Willem listened to their reports with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He had been an architect of this expedition, had approved its methods, and supported its escalations. But hearing the full account of what had transpired at the hamlet, even he seemed shaken by the magnitude of what his students had done. The samples they had brought back were valuable beyond measure. The knowledge they had gained would transform Byrgenwerth's understanding of the Great Ones, but the cost, Willem began to suspect, might prove higher than anyone had anticipated. The manifestations of Kos's curse continued to evolve. In the months that followed, some expedition members began to change physically, developing abnormalities that echoed the transformations of the hamlet's villagers. Others experienced mental deterioration, their ability to distinguish between dreams and reality eroding steadily until they could no longer function in normal society. A few attempted to end their own lives, seeking to escape a torment that offered no risk, but death, the expedition members discovered, provided no escape from Kos's judgment. The first evidence of this terrible truth came when one of the scholars, driven mad by weeks of unrelenting nightmares, threw himself from the highest tower of Byrgenwerth. His body was collected and prepared for burial, according to the college's tradition. But that night, those who had known him dreamed of something impossible. They saw him, not dead, but transformed, wandering through a landscape that resembled the hamlet, but was twisted beyond recognition. His mouth moved, forming words they could not quite hear. His eyes, though clearly damaged by the fall, still seemed to see them watching. More expedition members died, from suicide or from the physical consequences of their transformations. Each death produced the same result. Their essences did not pass on to whatever rest awaited normal souls. Instead, they were captured, drawn into a realm that existed somewhere between dreaming and death. A realm that was being shaped, moment by moment, into a perfect recreation of the site of their greatest sin. The hunter's nightmare, as it would come to be called, was Kos's true curse. Not content with tormenting her killers in life, she had created a dimension of punishment that would endure beyond their deaths. Every hunter and scholar who had participated in the massacre was bound to this nightmare, condemned to relive their crimes for all eternity. The hamlet where they had committed such atrocities became their eternal prison, a place where the line between perpetrator and victim blurred until neither concept retained meaning. Maria watched as her companions succumbed, one by one. She witnessed Geirmund's transformation, saw the weight of guilt dent him down until he could barely stand. She observed Lawrence's descent into something that was no longer recognizably human, his brilliant mind fragmenting under the pressure of Kos's judgment. Each loss reinforced the truth that Maria could not escape. She too was cursed. She too would eventually be claimed by the nightmare. No matter what she did or where she fled, Kos's dying attention had touched her soul, and it would never let go. In the face of this realization, Maria made a choice. She would not wait for death to claim her. She would not struggle futilely against a fate that had already been written. Instead, she would seek out the heart of the nightmare, confront whatever waited her there, and accept the consequences of what she had failed to prevent. But first, she needed to say goodbye to the only thing she had ever truly loved. The weapon that Geirmund had given her, the blade that had made her one of the greatest hunters who ever lived, could not accompany her where she was going, was too pure, too connected to a time before her fall from grace. Maria traveled to a place that would later be called the Fishing Hamlet, though it existed now only as a twisted reflection of the village she remembered. There, at the bottom of an ancient well, she threw her beloved Rakuyo into the darkness and listened to it fall. The splash, when it came, marked the end of Lady Maria's career as a hunter. She would never wield that weapon again. What remained of her life would be spent in waiting, in watching over a door that must never be opened, in guarding secrets that must never be revealed. Until someone came to give her the death she sought, Maria would remain a sentinel of guilt at the threshold of cosmic horror. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Suffering. The hunter's nightmare operates according to rules that defy normal understanding of space and time. It is not simply a dream or a memory, though it contains elements of both. It is a dimension of punishment, shaped by the dying will of a great one, and populated by the souls of those who earned her wrath. To understand what the nightmare is, we must first understand what Kos intended when she created it. The Great Ones exist partially outside what humans experience as time. They perceive past, present, and future as interconnected aspects of a single reality, rather than as a linear progression. When Kos died, she used this cosmic perspective to construct something that would persist beyond her physical demise. The nightmare she created was anchored to the moment of her greatest suffering, but it extended in all directions, capturing the souls of her tormentors regardless of when or how they died. The geography of the nightmare reflects this complex relationship with time. The hamlet where the massacre occurred exists at its center, but it has been transformed by Kos's grief and rage. Buildings that stood during the original events have been twisted into impossible configurations. Streets that once connected homes to shores now loop back on themselves, trapping travelers in eternal circuits of wandering. The sky is locked in a state of perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something between that serves to disorient and confuse. The sea that surrounds the nightmare hamlet is perhaps its most terrible feature. It is not water as humans understand it. It is the accumulated sorrow of Kos herself, given liquid form and released to engulf everything in its path. Those who venture too deep into this cosmic ocean find themselves dissolving, their sense of individual identity eroding until they become nothing more than drops in an infinite sea of grief. The inhabitants of the nightmare reflect the crime that created it. The villagers who were massacred alongside their goddess have been reborn as twisted parodies of what they were in life. Their fish-like features, once seen as blessings from Kos, have become grotesque and threatening. They shamble through the ruined hamlet, attacking any hunter they encounter with the mindless fury of beings whose suffering has erased all capacity for thought or mercy. But the villagers are victims in the nightmare, just as they were victims in life. The true punished are the hunters themselves. Every scholar and warrior who participated in the massacre has been drawn into Kos's creation, condemned to exist in a state of perpetual blood-drunk rage. Their minds have been stripped of everything except the capacity for violence. They wander the nightmare's twisted landscapes, attacking each other and anything else they encounter, reliving their sins through an eternity of meaningless combat. Some of the more powerful figures from the expedition retain scraps of their former identities. These blood-drunk hunters remember fragments of who they were and why they were condemned. This partial awareness makes their punishment all the more terrible. They know they are trapped, they know they deserve to be trapped, and they know there is no possibility of escape, no hope of redemption, nothing ahead of them but endless repetition of the violence that defined their fall from grace. The nightmare also contains something that was not created by Kos, but emerged as a consequence of her dying. The orphan, murdered before it could truly live, has been reborn in this place of punishment, but it is not the helpless infant that was vivisected on that terrible morning. It has become something else, transformed by its mother's grief and its own truncated potential into a being of pure rage and despair. The orphan wanders the shores of the nightmare, emerging periodically from Kos's corpse, which lies beached at the edge of the sea. It screams with a voice that carries all the pain of its abbreviated existence, all the sorrow of a mother who could not protect her child. When it encounters other inhabitants of the nightmare, it attacks with a ferocity that defies description. But its violence is not the calculated cruelty of the hunters who murdered it. It is the thrashing of a wounded animal, the desperate lashing out of something that has known nothing but suffering since the moment of its birth. The relationship between the orphan and the nightmare's other inhabitants reveals something profound about Kos's curse. The Great One did not simply create a prison for her tormentors. She created a reality where they would be haunted by the consequences of their actions in the most direct way possible. Every hunter who enters the nightmare must eventually face the orphan. They must confront what they created through their violence. They must die again and again at the hands of the child they murdered. Yet, even this is not the full extent of Kos's design. The nightmare is connected to the waking world in ways that allow its influence to spread beyond its cursed inhabitants. Hunters who were not present at the massacre, who were born long after the events at the hamlet, can be drawn into the nightmare through their use of blood. The old blood carries memory, and among its memories are the sins committed in its name. Those who partake too deeply of blood ministration risk awakening connections to a curse that was never specifically aimed at them. This spreading contamination ensures that the nightmare will never lack for inhabitants. As long as hunters continue to use the blood, as long as the beast scourge continues to claim victims, new souls will be drawn into Kos's creation. The Great One's revenge extends beyond the specific individuals who wronged her to encompass everyone who benefits from or perpetuates the system that made her murder possible. The Healing Church, which rose from the ashes of Byrgenwerth to spread blood ministration throughout Yharnam, became the primary vector for this ongoing curse. Hunters who served the church thought they were protecting humanity from the beast scourge. They did not realize that every time they used blood to enhance their abilities, they were strengthening their connection to a nightmare that waited to claim them. The more successful they were, the more blood they consumed, the more certain their eventual damnation became. This is the true horror of the hunter's nightmare. It is not simply a place of punishment for historical villains. It is an ongoing system of cosmic justice that catches everyone who participates in the violence that began at the fishing hamlet. There is no innocent use of the blood. There is no way to hunt without becoming complicit in the original sin. Every blow struck against a beast brings the hunter closer to the nightmare. Every level gained through blood echoes strengthens the chains that bind them to Kos's judgment. The few who understand this truth face an impossible choice. They can refuse to use the blood and be overwhelmed by the beast scourge that threatens everything they love. Or they can embrace the power the blood provides and accept that they are trading their souls for temporary advantage. There is no third option. There is no way to fight monsters without becoming one. The nightmare waits for everyone, patient and eternal, ready to welcome new arrivals into its endless cycle of violence and despair. Chapter 7. Maria's Vigil. Lady Maria did not go quietly into the nightmare. Unlike her companions, who were consumed by their guilt or destroyed by their transformations, Maria retained enough of herself to make a choice about how she would spend what remained of her existence. She chose to wait. The weight of what Maria had witnessed pressed upon her constantly. Even in her waking hours, she could not escape the memories of the hamlet. She saw the villagers' faces, frozen in expressions of terror and betrayal. She heard the orphans' cries echoing through corridors of her mind that had never contained such sounds before. She felt Kos's dying attention brush against her consciousness, that final curse settling into her soul like sediment at the bottom of a still lake. The decision to abandon her weapon was not made lightly. The Rikio had been Maria's constant companion through years of hunting, a gift from Gehrman that represented both his faith in her abilities and their complicated relationship as mentor and student. The blade had saved her life countless times. It had cut down beasts and humans, and things that were neither. It had become an extension of her body, as essential to her existence as her own arms and legs. But the Rikio was also a symbol of everything Maria could no longer tolerate about herself. It was a hunter's weapon, designed for violence, perfected through centuries of refinement for the specific purpose of taking lives. Every time Maria looked at it, she was reminded of what she had been trained to do and what she had failed to do when it mattered most. She had been capable of such violence. She had simply chosen not to use that capability when innocent lives hung in the balance. After discarding her beloved Rikio at the bottom of that ancient well, Maria made her way to a place that existed on the boundary between the waking world and the nightmare. The astral clock tower stood at the threshold of Kos's creation, its mechanisms marking time according to principles that bore no relationship to the movement of celestial bodies. Within its walls, the distinction between dream and reality grew thin enough that a person might step from one to the other without realizing the transition had occurred. The clock tower itself was a marvel of architecture and cosmic engineering. Its gears and pendulums operated according to mathematics that would have driven any conventional engineer to madness. The time it measured was not the familiar progression of seconds and minutes, but something else entirely, a flow of moments that connected the physical world to the nightmare realm. Maria had come to guard. She explored the clock tower thoroughly in those early days, learning its hidden passages and secret chambers. The structure had clearly been built by beings who understood cosmic geometry in ways that human minds could barely approach. Some rooms seemed larger on the inside than their exterior dimensions should have allowed. Some corridors led to destinations that changed depending on the time of day, or the phase of the moon, or factors that Maria could never identify. In the highest chamber, she found what would become her station. A large room dominated by a clock face that looked out over an impossible vista. From this vantage point, Maria could see the nightmare spreading below, the twisted recreation of the hamlet where her crimes had been committed. She could watch the blood-drunk hunters wandering its streets, could observe the transformed villagers going about their eternal routines of grief and violence. Maria established herself in the clock tower's highest chamber and began her vigil. She was not waiting for rescue or redemption. Those possibilities had been foreclosed the moment she failed to stop the massacre. She was waiting for someone to come and kill her. In death, she believed, she might find a peace that had been denied her in life. Until then, she would guard the entrance to the nightmare, ensuring that no one else would be drawn into Kos's curse through the door she protected. She fashioned a new weapon from her own blood, utilizing the Canehurst heritage she had spent so long trying to escape. The vile blood technique she had learned in childhood, dismissed as barbaric by the scholars of Byrgenwerth, proved useful for creating a blade that responded to her will. This weapon would serve her in the fights to come, though she hoped each battle would be her last. The years passed, though Maria could not have said how many. Time moved strangely in the clock tower, sometimes racing forward in apparent moments, and sometimes crawling so slowly that each second felt like an eternity. She did not eat or sleep in any conventional sense. The blood that ran through her veins, that Canehurst heritage she had once tried so hard to leave behind, sustained her in ways that defied natural law. In her solitude, Maria had ample opportunity to reflect on everything that had led her to this place. She thought about Byrgenwerth and the excitement she had felt upon being invited to join its expeditions. She remembered her training under Yharnam, the way he had seemed to see potential in her that no one else recognized. She recalled the early days of the Hamlet investigation, when everything still seemed like a noble pursuit of knowledge rather than a prelude to atrocity. Most of all, she thought about the moments when she might have made different choices. What if she had spoken up more forcefully when the research began to turn cruel? What if she had physically intervened to protect the villagers or the orphan? What if she had simply walked away, abandoning the expedition and its members to their fate? These alternative histories played out in her mind with the vividness of actual memory, tormenting her with visions of paths not taken. But Maria was not prone to self-deception. She knew that her guilt was not just about failing to act. It was about active participation. She had been present during procedures that violated every principle she claimed to hold. She had watched Yharnam suppress the villagers' resistance without lifting a finger to help them. She had stood by as Kos screamed her grief to an indifferent sky. The blood was not just on her hands. Through proximity, she had earned her place in the nightmare as surely as any of the more enthusiastic participants. During her vigil, Maria occasionally received visitors. Most were blood-drunk hunters who had wandered into the clock tower without understanding where they were. These she killed quickly and without ceremony, giving them the release they sought, even if they did not know they sought it. A few were more conscious of their situation, pilgrims who had learned of the nightmare and sought to understand it. These Maria turned away when she could and killed when she could not. The secrets of the hamlet were not meant for the living. She also received communications from the waking world, though these grew less frequent as the years passed. The healing church, which had risen from the wreckage of Byrgenwerth to dominate Yharnam's religious life, sent occasional emissaries seeking information about the research conducted at the hamlet. Maria told them nothing. She had seen what their predecessors had done with such knowledge and had no intention of enabling further atrocities. The church's interest in the hamlet faded as other concerns demanded attention. The beast scourge intensified, spreading through Yharnam's population with devastating speed. Hunters were recruited in ever greater numbers, trained using methods that Yharnam had developed and equipped with weapons derived from Byrgenwerth's research. None of them knew the true origin of the blood they used or the curse that came with it. Maria watched from her distant perch as a new generation marched toward the same damnation that had claimed her companions. Yharnam himself appeared at the clock tower once, though Maria could not have said when this visitation occurred in the strange temporal flow of her existence. He had aged visibly since she had last seen him, the weight of his sins pressing down upon him with physical force. He came not to seek entry to the nightmare, but to speak with the student he had trained and then abandoned to face the consequences of their shared guilt. Their conversation was brief and painful, Geishra and explained that he had established a system to contain the nightmare's influence, a dream realm where hunters would be bound and protected from the worst consequences of their blood-soaked vocation. He had done this, he said, not to redeem himself, but to prevent others from suffering as they had suffered. The moon presence, that cosmic entity whose attention he had attracted through decades of hunting, had agreed to sustain this system in exchange for gay men's eternal service. Maria listened to all of this without comment. When Gaiman finished, she asked only one question. Does it help? Does any of it make what we did less terrible? Gaiman had no answer. He departed the clock tower and did not return. Maria resumed her vigil, no closer to the death she sought, but perhaps slightly closer to understanding the purpose of her continued existence. If she could not undo the harm she had caused, she could at least prevent others from adding to it. The door she guarded would remain closed as long as she lived to defend it. The centuries passed. Yharnam rose to prominence on the strength of the blood, then began its long descent into chaos, as the beast's scourge overwhelmed the church's ability to contain it. Generations of hunters lived and died, each one drawn closer to the nightmare by their use of the old blood. The curse Kos had pronounced continued to spread, touching lives that had no direct connection to the original massacre, but were nonetheless bound by the chains of blood and memory. Through it all, Maria waited. She knew that someone would eventually come who was capable of defeating her. She knew that her vigil would end not with redemption, but with death. She was content with this knowledge. Death was what she had sought since the day she threw her weapon into that ancient well. Everything between that moment and her eventual fall was simply waiting, simply enduring until the universe saw fit to grant her the release she deserved. When the hunter finally came, Maria recognized them for what they were: a seeker of truth, like the scholars who had destroyed the hamlet, a warrior of exceptional skill, like the hunters who had suppressed the villagers' resistance, someone bound by the blood and destined for the nightmare, someone who needed to know what lay beyond the door she protected, even if that knowledge would ultimately destroy them. Maria rose from her seat for the first time in what might have been centuries. She drew not the rakiyo she had discarded, but a new weapon, one fashioned from her own blood and animated by the power of her Cainhurst heritage. The fight that followed was the most intense of her existence, a dance of death that pushed both combatants to their absolute limits. In the end, Maria lost. Not because she was weaker than her opponent, though the hunter proved formidable indeed. She lost because she wanted to lose. Because death was the only thing she had sought since that terrible morning on the shores of the fishing hamlet. Because her vigil was finally over and she could rest at last. A corpse should be left well alone, she whispered as she fell. Oh, I know very well how the secrets beckon so sweetly. Only an honest death will cure you now, liberate you from your wild curiosity. The door behind her opened. The nightmare awaited. Chapter 8. The Orphan's Lament. Beyond Maria's final resting place, past the entrance she had guarded for so long, the hunter's nightmare revealed its deepest and most terrible secret. The path led down, always down, through twisted representations of the hamlet and its surroundings. The buildings that lined this route were not quite the structures that had stood during the massacre. They were memories of buildings, reconstructions filtered through the grief and rage of a dying goddess. The villagers encountered along this descent were similarly transformed. Their fish-like features had become more pronounced in death, blending with the rot and decay that characterized everything in the nightmare. They attacked intruders with weapons fashioned from the sea itself, anchors and harpoons encrusted with shells and seaweed. Their cries echoed through the empty streets, sounds that might have been language once, but had devolved into pure expressions of anguish. At the end of this path, at the very bottom of the nightmare, lay the shore where everything had begun. The sea stretched to the horizon, but it was not the sea that the villagers had fished in life. It was something else, a cosmic ocean composed of accumulated sorrow and rage. Things moved in its depths, shapes that might have been sea creatures, or might have been thoughts given physical form. and there, beached on the sand, like the corpse of a whale, lay Kos. The Great One's body had not decomposed, despite the apparent passage of centuries. Her flesh remained pale and luminescent, her countless eyes still open, though no longer seeing. The wounds inflicted during the massacre were visible, cuts and punctures that marked where the scholars had extracted their samples. She lay perfectly still, a monument to the violence that had claimed her. The sight of Kos on that shore was both horrifying and heartbreaking. In death, she seemed somehow smaller than the descriptions of her living form had suggested. The immense presence that had overwhelmed scholars' minds and inspired villagers' worship had departed, leaving behind only flesh and memory. The Great One who had blessed a community for generations, who had given of herself to creatures so far beneath her, in cosmic terms, lay abandoned on a beach at the edge of reality. Around her body, the signs of what had been done remained visible. The sand was stained with fluids that time had not erased. Tools and implements lay scattered across the shore, left behind by researchers in their haste to collect samples. The placenta from which the orphan had emerged still lay partially in the water, transformed by cosmic energy into something that pulsed with faint luminescence even now. But Kos was not truly dead, not in any sense that humans understood death. A portion of her consciousness persisted, woven into the fabric of the nightmare she had created. Through this remnant awareness, she continued to shape the realm around her, ensuring that it served its purpose as an instrument of punishment. She could not act directly anymore, could not speak or move or defend herself, but she could dream, and her dreams gave form to the nightmare that trapped her murderers. The connection between Kos's dreaming consciousness and the nightmare realm explained many of its stranger properties: the way time flowed differently in different areas, the way geography shifted and reformed according to patterns that seemed random but actually reflected cosmic emotional states, the way certain beings were trapped more securely than others, their punishment calibrated to the severity of their crimes. All of these emerged from Kos's ongoing awareness, her endless contemplation of what had been done to her and her child. The hunter who reached this shore after defeating Maria found themselves in a place of profound cosmic significance. Here at the heart of Korisa's creation, the veil between the physical and spiritual grew thin enough to perceive truths normally hidden from mortal awareness. The nature of the Great Ones, the origins of the old blood, the mechanisms by which the nightmare sustained itself, all of these became visible to one who possessed sufficient insight to see. But insight into cosmic truths was not the only thing waiting on that blood-soaked shore. The orphan waited there as well. It emerged from Kos's body as if being born anew, a figure that looked almost human at first glance, but revealed its alien nature upon closer examination. Its skin was pale and mottled, covered in fluids that resembled amniotic fluid, but carried properties far beyond any natural substance. Its body was hunched and emaciated, the frame of an infant stretched to adult dimensions without proper development. In its hands, it clutched its placenta, transformed by cosmic energy into a weapon of terrible power. The orphan screamed as it emerged, a sound that combined the cry of a newborn with the rage of something that had been denied any chance at life. This scream was not merely loud, it was a wave of psychic force that washed over the shore, carrying with it centuries of accumulated grief. Anyone who heard it experienced, for a brief moment, the totality of the orphan's suffering, the terror of being ripped from its mother's womb, the agony of being dissected while still conscious, the endless torment of existence in a realm constructed from pain. The fight that followed was unlike any other encounter in the nightmare. The orphan did not fight with the calculated technique of a trained warrior or the bestial instinct of a corrupted beast. It fought with the desperation of something that had nothing to lose, that had never possessed anything to lose, that existed only as a vessel for pain seeking release through violence. Its attacks were wild and unpredictable, swinging its placental weapon in arcs that seemed to defy physics. When damaged, it did not retreat or adapt its strategy. It simply became more aggressive, pouring more of its impossible vitality into each blow. The shore itself responded to its rage, lightning crashing down from the turbulent sky, waves rising and falling in sympathy with its emotional state. As the fight progressed, the orphan began to transform. The humanoid shape that had emerged from Kos gave way to something more directly cosmic, a form that reflected its true nature as the child of a great one. Wings that were not quite wings sprouted from its back, its face stretched and distorted, revealing features that bore no relationship to any earthly creature. Its scream changed in pitch and intensity, becoming something that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly in the consciousness. The second phase of the fight was even more brutal than the first. The transformed orphan moved faster, hit harder, and displayed powers that suggested it was finally accessing its cosmic inheritance. Lighting became its constant companion, striking the shore with each of its more powerful attacks. The placental weapon extended and changed shape, becoming something between a mace and a tentacle. Reality itself seemed to strain under the pressure of the orphan's unleashed potential. And through it all, that terrible cry continued. Not in triumph or rage alone, but in something more complex and more heartbreaking. The orphan was not just fighting. It was pleading. It was demanding an answer to a question that had no answer. Why? Why had it been created only to be destroyed? Why had its mother suffered and died? Why did existence contain such cruelty, such meaningless violence? No answer came. No answer could come. The hunter who faced the orphan could offer only death, the same gift that Maria had sought for so long. And eventually, after a battle that seemed to stretch beyond any normal measure of time, that gift was delivered. The orphan fell, its transformed body collapsing on the shore near its mother's corpse. Its final cry echoed across the nightmare, a sound of release as much as despair. But its death did not end the encounter. Something remained, a darkness hovering above Kos's body, connected to the Great One's corpse by a cord of shadow. This was the orphan's true self, the essence that existed beyond its physical form. As long as this shadow persisted, the orphan would return. The nightmare would continue. Kos's curse would remain in effect, trapping souls in eternal punishment, spreading contamination through the blood that sustained Yharnam's doomed populace. The hunter approached the shadow and did what needed to be done. The cord was severed, the darkness dissipated, and somewhere, in the spaces between worlds, a voice spoke for the first time in centuries. The curse is lifted. The nightmare did not disappear. The hunters and scholars trapped within its boundaries did not find sudden release. The consequences of the massacre could not be erased by a single act of violence, no matter how cosmically significant. But something had changed. The engine that powered the nightmare's expansion, the grief and rage of a mother for her murdered child, had finally been given what it sought. Not justice. Justice was impossible for crimes of this magnitude. Not redemption. The guilty remained guilty, their sins indelible. But acknowledgement, recognition. Someone had come to the heart of the nightmare and witnessed what had been done. Someone had faced the orphan and understood its suffering. Someone had cared enough to end its torment, even at tremendous cost. For Kos, this was enough. She had never sought the destruction of humanity or the corruption of the world. She had only wanted her child to be remembered, to matter to someone beyond herself. In dying to free the orphan from its endless cycle of birth and death, the hunter had given Kos the one thing she truly desired. Her child would not be forgotten. Its suffering would not be meaningless. It would live on in the memory of those who knew its story. The shore fell silent. The storm clouds parted, revealing for the first time a sky of deep and endless blue. The sea, that cosmic ocean of sorrow, grew calm. Kos's body remained where it had lain for centuries, but something about it had changed. It no longer seemed like a monument to tragedy. It seemed like a grave, a final resting place for a mother and child who had known too much pain and too little kindness. The hunter turned away from the shore and began the long journey back through the nightmare. Behind them, the curse was lifted. Ahead of them, Yharnam waited, as blood-soaked and beast-haunted as ever. The nightmare had been confronted, but the hunt was not over. It would never be over. The sins of the past could be acknowledged and understood, but they could not be undone. All that remained was to face the future with whatever wisdom the past had provided. Chapter 9. The Legacy of the Hamlet. The events at the Fishing Hamlet sent ripples through history that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of Kos's curse. The knowledge gained from those terrible experiments shaped the development of Yharnam's civilization for generations to come. The blood that the scholars extracted, the insights they derived from vivisecting a great one, and her child, became the foundation upon which the healing church built its power. Lawrence, despite his central role in the massacre, did not face immediate justice for his crimes. He returned to Byrgenwerth, transformed by what he had witnessed and done, convinced more than ever that the blood held the key to human transcendence. His relationship with Master Willem deteriorated as the provost, perhaps finally recognizing the monster his most brilliant student had become, began to advocate for a different path forward. The tensions between Lawrence and Willem had been building even before the Hamlet expedition. They disagreed about fundamental questions regarding the nature of cosmic insight and the means by which it should be pursued. Willem believed in a contemplative approach, using meditation and mental discipline to expand human consciousness without relying on external substances. Lawrence favored a more direct method, using the blood itself to facilitate transformation. These philosophical differences became impossible to reconcile. In the aftermath of the massacre, Willem had received reports of what had been done at the Hamlet, though the full scope of the atrocities would take time to emerge. What he learned horrified him. The methods Lawrence had employed violated everything Willem believed about responsible cosmic research. The pursuit of knowledge was valuable, certainly, but not at any cost. Some lines should never be crossed, and Lawrence had crossed them without hesitation. Their final confrontation took place in Willem's study at Byrgenwerth. The details of what was said remain unknown, but the outcome was clear. Lawrence departed the college, taking with him those scholars and hunters who shared his vision. Willem remained behind with his own followers, increasingly isolated as the consequences of the Hamlet expedition spread through the academic community. The philosophical split between Lawrence and Willem would shape the future of blood research. Willem believed that insight should be sought through careful cultivation of the mind, through developing the capacity to perceive cosmic truths directly, rather than absorbing them through external means. "Fear the old blood," he repeated, though now with the weight of the massacre lending his words new significance. The blood was too dangerous, too corrupting, too prone to dragging those who used it into the same darkness that had consumed the Hamlet expedition. Lawrence disagreed. He saw in the blood not a threat to be feared, but a tool to be mastered. The violence at the Hamlet had been regrettable, certainly, but the knowledge gained justified the methods used. Properly administered, properly controlled, the blood could transform humanity into something greater than it had ever been. The beast scourge that would eventually consume Yharnam was merely a challenge to be overcome, not evidence that the entire project was fundamentally flawed. The foundation of the healing church represented Lawrence's attempt to realize his vision on a grand scale. He established his new institution in Yharnam, choosing that location for its proximity to the labyrinth and the resources it contained. The church's initial focus was on healing, using the blood's miraculous properties to cure diseases and injuries that no other medicine could address. This medical mission provided both legitimacy and revenue, allowing the church to grow, while conducting more ambitious research in secret. The early years of the church's existence were marked by genuine medical achievements. Patients came from across the region, seeking treatments that were available nowhere else. Diseases that had plagued families for generations were cured with a single transfusion. Injuries that should have been fatal proved survivable with proper blood administration. The church's reputation spread, attracting both patients and potential recruits to its ranks. But the healing mission was always secondary to Lawrence's true purpose. Behind the public face of compassionate medicine, the church conducted research that continued the work begun at the Hamlet. Scholars studied the samples extracted from Kos, seeking to understand the mechanisms by which cosmic biology produced its extraordinary effects. They experimented on willing subjects, testing the limits of blood transformation and documenting the result. They developed techniques for refining and administering the blood, making it safer for general use while preserving its transformative potential. This research inevitably produced failures. Some subjects transformed into beasts, their humanity consumed by the cosmic contamination in the blood. Others experienced mental deterioration, their minds unable to process the cosmic awareness that blood ministration introduced. Still others died outright, their bodies rejecting the foreign substance in catastrophic fashion. Lawrence viewed these failures as necessary costs of progress. Every experiment, successful or not, provided data that advanced understanding. The subjects who suffered had volunteered, knowing the risks, and their sacrifice contributed to a project that would ultimately benefit all humanity. This calculus, so similar to the reasoning that had justified the Hamlet Massacre, revealed how little Lawrence had learned from his previous atrocities. The beast's scourge emerged gradually at first, isolated cases that could be explained as individual aberrations. A patient here, a church member there, transforming into something no longer recognizable as human. These early beasts were destroyed quietly, their existence concealed from the general population, to avoid undermining public confidence in the church's healing mission. This debate split Byrgenwerth. Scholars who had participated in the Hamlet's expedition found themselves choosing sides, their guilt manifesting as either rejection of everything the blood represented or doubling down on its potential. Those who followed Willem remained at the college, pursuing their master's vision of insight through internal development. Those who followed Lawrence departed to found what would become the healing church. The church rose to prominence on the strength of the blood's healing properties. Lawrence and his followers established themselves in Yharnam, offering miraculous cures for diseases and injuries that no other medicine could address. The citizens flocked to them, grateful recipients of treatments that seemed to make impossible recoveries routine. Within a generation, the healing church had become the dominant institution in Yharnam, its clergy wielding both spiritual and political authority. But the church's foundation was built on blood extracted from cosmic horror. The healing administered to Yharnam citizens carried traces of Kos's essence, fragments of Great One biology that gradually accumulated in the bodies and minds of those who received treatment. The beast scourge, when it finally emerged, was not a new phenomenon, but the inevitable consequence of what had been done at the Hamlet decades earlier. The citizens who transformed into beasts were simply manifesting the cosmic contamination that had been introduced into their bloodlines through the church's ministrations. The hunters who arose to combat the beast scourge were similarly tainted. Their weapons, derived from designs developed during the Hamlet expedition, were optimized for use against creatures of cosmic origin. Their techniques, passed down from Gehrman to successive generations, were designed to exploit the weaknesses of beings that blended human and Great One characteristics. And their blood, the substance that allowed them to recover from wounds that should have been fatal, was the same old blood that had been discovered in the labyrinth and refined through experiments on Kos and her child. Every aspect of Yharnam's response to the beast scourge was shaped by the legacy of the Hamlet Massacre. The violence that had been committed on that distant shore echoed through centuries of subsequent history, contaminating everything it touched. The hunters thought they were protecting humanity from an external threat. They did not realize that they were perpetuating the very system that had created the threat in the first place. Lady Maria's vigil at the astral clock tower was one attempt to contain this legacy. By guarding the entrance to the hunter's nightmare, she hoped to prevent the truth about the Hamlet from spreading, but she could not guard against the blood itself, which carried memories of the massacre in every drop. As long as the church administered blood ministrations, as long as hunters used blood vials to enhance their abilities, the truth about what had been done to Kos would continue to spread through Yharnam's population. Other figures from the original expedition met various fates. Yharnam, as noted, established the hunter's dream as a way to contain the nightmare's influence. His creation provided a safe space for hunters to develop their skills without being immediately consumed by the curse, though it ultimately fed souls to the moon presence. in exchange for this protection. Whether this arrangement represented redemption or merely a new form of exploitation remained ambiguous. Some expedition members simply disappeared, their fate unknown to history. They may have fled to distant lands, seeking to escape the curse through physical distance. They may have succumbed to the transformations that claimed so many of their companions. They may have found ways to end their existence that left no trace, erasing themselves from the world in a final attempt to escape the consequences of their actions. The villagers of the hamlet fared worst of all. Their community was destroyed, their goddess murdered, their children transformed into monsters. Those who survived the massacre found themselves drawn into the nightmare, where they would remain for eternity alongside the hunters who had killed them. The distinction between victim and perpetrator blurred in that cursed realm, all of them trapped together in a recreation of the site of their shared trauma. Only Kos herself found something approaching peace. Her physical form remained on the nightmare's shore, but her consciousness persisted in the realm she had created. When the orphan was finally freed from its cycle of rebirth, Kos too was released from her role as the nightmare's architect. She could rest at last, her child acknowledged, her suffering witnessed, her curse lifted, even if its consequences continued. The hunters who came after, who faced the nightmare and its inhabitants, did so without understanding the full history of what they confronted. They saw blood-drunk hunters and transformed villagers as enemies to be overcome, not as fellow victims of a tragedy that had begun before they were born. They fought and killed and died, adding their own suffering to the accumulated pain of centuries without ever grasping the original cause. This ignorance was perhaps the ultimate legacy of the Hamlet Massacre. The truth about what happened there was buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy and deliberate obfuscation. The healing church could not admit that its power was built on atrocity. The hunters could not acknowledge that their profession originated in crimes against innocent people and cosmic beings alike. The citizens of Yharnam could not face the reality that their miraculous healings came at the cost of a goddess's life and a child's torment. So the truth remained hidden, preserved only in the nightmare and in the memories of those who had participated in the original events. The scholars who wrote Yharnam's histories recorded the rise of the healing church and the emergence of the beast scourge without ever mentioning the connection between them. The hunters who learned their trade from Gaiman's successors mastered techniques without knowing their origin. The citizens who received blood ministrations accepted their healings as divine gifts without questioning what had been done to make such gifts possible. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Present. For those who ventured deep enough into the nightmare, who pieced together the fragments of evidence scattered throughout Bloodborne's world, the story of the Fishing Hamlet becomes a lens through which everything else can be understood. The beast scourge, the healing church's corruption, the endless cycle of violence that consumes Yharnam night after night. All of these trace their origins to that morning on the shore when scholars became butchers. The old blood that flows through Yharnam's veins carries the memory of what was done. It carries fragments of Kos's consciousness, traces of the orphan's suffering, echoes of the villagers' screams. Every citizen who receives blood ministration absorbs a portion of this history. Every hunter who uses blood vials to fuel their abilities strengthens their connection to the original sin. The curse that Kos pronounced is not a separate phenomenon from the beast scourge. They are aspects of the same cosmic tragedy, different manifestations of the contamination that began when the scholars first cut into divine flesh. This understanding transforms the experience of playing through Bloodborne. The beasts that hunters slaughter are not simply monsters to be eliminated. They are the products of experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, descendants of procedures that violated every principle of ethical research. The hunters themselves are not simply heroes protecting innocence. They are participants in a system that perpetuates the original violence, using tools and techniques developed through atrocity, empowered by blood extracted from murdered gods. The knowledge of what happened at the hamlet casts every subsequent encounter in a different light. The cleric beast that terrorizes the streets, was once a member of the healing church, transformed by the same blood that was extracted from Kos. The blood-starved beast that lurks in old Yharnam was once a citizen who trusted the church to heal them. Father Gascoigne, the hunter who has succumbed to blood-drunk madness, represents what awaits everyone who walks this path long enough. Even the friendly characters encountered throughout Yharnam take on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of the Hamlet Massacre. The chapel dwellers who provide refuge are sustained by the same corrupted blood that powers the beast's scourge. The skeptical characters who mock the church's beliefs may be closer to the truth than they realize. The hunters who fight alongside the player are fellow participants in systems built on foundations of cosmic violence. The weapons and tools that hunters employ carry their own connections to the original sin. The trick weapons were developed through research that began at Byrgenwerth, using principles learned from studying Pthumerian artifacts and refined through experiments conducted at the Hamlet. The hunter's badge that grants access to restricted weapons represents membership in an organization whose authority derives from centuries of violence. Even the blood vials that hunters use to heal themselves are processed from the same contaminated source that created the beast scourge. The various factions that compete for control of Yharnam can all be traced back to the Hamlet in some way. The healing church is Lawrence's legacy, built on the foundation of what he learned from vivisecting Kos. The choir, that elite group of scholars who seek direct communion with great ones, are the spiritual descendants of Willem's original vision, pursuing cosmic insight through methods that differ from the church's but share the same ultimate origin. The School of Menses, with its deranged attempts to contact the great ones through ritual and sacrifice, represents the logical extreme of the ambitions that drove the Hamlet expedition. Even the dream that sustains the player's journey is connected to the massacre. Geyserman created the hunter's dream to contain the nightmare's influence, but his creation is ultimately dependent on the same systems that the nightmare opposes. The moon presence that sustains the dream feeds on the hunters who use it, just as Kos's curse feeds on the souls of those drawn into her nightmare. Both are cosmic entities manipulating human beings for their own purposes, using the violence of the hunt to achieve goals that transcend human understanding. The player who uncovers this history faces a choice that the game presents without explicit commentary. They can continue the hunt, perpetuating the cycle of violence that began at the Hamlet. They can seek to break free of the dream's control, rejecting the systems that bind them to cosmic masters. They can even attempt to transcend humanity entirely, following the path that Lawrence originally envisioned, albeit at the cost of everything that makes them human. None of these choices undo what was done at the Fishing Hamlet. The massacre cannot be prevented or reversed. The villagers will remain transformed. The orphan will remain tormented. Kos will remain dead. The best that any hunter can achieve is to understand what happened and carry that understanding forward, to remember the victims, to acknowledge the perpetrators, to ensure that the truth is not forgotten, even if it can never be corrected. This is ultimately what the player provides when they defeat the orphan and sever its connection to Kos's corpse. Not justice, because justice is impossible. Not redemption, because redemption would require undoing harms that cannot be undone. Simply witness. Recognition that what happened mattered, that the suffering was real, that someone cared enough to learn the truth and act on that knowledge. In a world where institutions lie about their origins and hunters perpetuate cycles of violence without understanding their source, this witness is perhaps the most valuable thing that can be offered. The nightmare persists, but it is no longer hidden. The curse remains, but its origin is known. Future hunters who venture into the nightmare will do so with access to the truth, able to make informed choices about their participation in systems that were built on atrocity. Chapter 11. The Weight of Knowledge. Understanding the story of the Fishing Hamlet changes how we interpret everything else in Bloodborne. The cosmic horror that permeates the game is not simply alien indifference or supernatural malevolence. It is the consequence of human choices, the result of scholars who decided that knowledge was more important than the lives they destroyed to obtain it. This framing transforms the Great Ones from incomprehensible cosmic entities into something more complex. Kos was not inherently hostile to humanity. She had lived peacefully alongside her worshippers for generations, blessing them with health and prosperity without demanding violence in return. Her curse was a response to specific crimes committed by specific individuals, not an expression of cosmic antipathy toward the human species. The same can be said of the other Great Ones encountered throughout the game. Odin, the Formless One, does not seek to destroy humanity. He seeks children to fill the void left by his lost offspring, a motivation that is tragic rather than malevolent. Rom, the vacuous spider, guards humanity against cosmic truths that most people could not survive knowing, an act of protection disguised as obstruction. Even the moon presence, for all its apparent manipulation, may be seeking something that resembles genuine connection rather than mere exploitation. This interpretation casts the scholars of Byrgenwerth and their successors in an even darker light. They were not innocent seekers of truth who stumbled upon forces beyond their control. They were aggressors who chose to violate beings that meant them no harm. The cosmic horror they unleashed was not an inevitable consequence of human curiosity, but a specific result of their specific decisions to commit atrocity. The beast scourge, in this reading, is not a plague sent by vengeful gods, but a form of contamination introduced through deliberate action. The old blood that transforms citizens into beasts was never meant for human consumption. It was stolen from beings who were murdered to obtain it, and it carries the trauma of that theft in every drop. The transformation it causes is not random or senseless. It is the expression of cosmic grief, working through biological systems that were never designed to contain it. This understanding does not make the beast scourge less terrible. If anything, it makes it more terrible, because it reveals that the suffering could have been prevented. The scholars did not have to kill Ko. They did not have to vivisect the orphan. They chose these actions, and they chose to spread the resulting contamination throughout Yharnam's population. The beasts that hunters slaughter night after night are victims of decisions made long before they were born. The hunters themselves occupy an uncomfortable position in this moral framework. They are both perpetrators and victims, using tainted blood to fight tainted blood, killing beasts who were once innocent citizens, transformed by forces they never understood. Their heroism, such as it is, consists of managing a crisis that they are simultaneously perpetuating. Every vial of blood they consume strengthens their connection to the original sin. Every beast they slay adds another soul to the accumulated suffering that emanates from the hamlet's shores. There is no clean resolution to this dilemma. The hunt cannot end while the beast scourge continues, and the beast scourge cannot end while the old blood remains in circulation. Breaking free of this cycle would require either destroying all traces of the contamination or preventing it from spreading further, and neither option is available to the hunters who patrol Yharnam's streets. What remains is awareness, understanding, the knowledge that what hunters do, what Yharnam endures, what the nightmare preserves, all of it connects to choices made by human beings who believed their purposes justified any means. This knowledge does not provide solutions, but it provides perspective. It allows those who possess it to make informed choices about their participation in systems that they did not create, but that they now sustain through their actions. The player who completes the Old Hunters DLC emerges with exactly this knowledge. They have witnessed what was done at the hamlet. They have confronted the orphan and freed it from its endless cycle of rebirth. They have lifted the curse. Though they cannot undo the damage it has caused, they return to the waking world, changed by what they have learned, carrying the truth about Bloodborne's original sin into whatever ending they ultimately achieve. This truth does not make subsequent challenges easier. The nightmare's revelations do not grant power or provide tactical advantages. What they provide is meaning. The hunt that follows is no longer just a struggle for survival against incomprehensible cosmic forces. It is an attempt to build something better on the foundations of acknowledged tragedy. It is an assertion that the suffering of the past matters, that the victims deserve to be remembered, that the future does not have to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. Whether this assertion proves accurate is left for each player to determine. The endings available in Bloodborne range from acceptance of cosmic cycles to attempts at transcendence to simple death and release. None of them explicitly address what was learned in the nightmare or provide clear resolutions to the moral questions raised by the Hamlet story. The game refuses easy answers, leaving players to grapple with the implications of what they have witnessed. Chapter 12. Farewell to the Nightmare. As we conclude our journey through the story of the Fishing Hamlet Massacre, it seems fitting to pause and reflect on what this tale reveals about the world of Bloodborne, and perhaps about our own relationship with the stories we consume. The Hamlet Massacre is not the only atrocity in Bloodborne's history. The Cimmerian civilization that preceded modern Yharnam committed its own sins in pursuit of cosmic knowledge. The healing church that rose from Byrgenwerth's ashes has perpetrated countless additional horrors in the centuries since the original expedition. The hunters who served these institutions have killed and killed again, piling bodies upon bodies in a pyramid of violence that reaches toward the heavens. But the hamlet holds a special place in this chronicle of suffering because it was the beginning. Before the scholars came to that remote shore, the Great Ones and humanity might have coexisted without the devastation that followed. Kos had demonstrated that cosmic beings could interact peacefully with human populations. Her worshippers had been transformed, yes, but they had been transformed willingly, embracing changes that they understood as blessings rather than curses. The massacre destroyed this possibility. It demonstrated to the Great Ones that humanity could not be trusted, that any offer of communion might become an opportunity for exploitation. The curse that Kos pronounced was not just punishment for specific individuals, but a warning to other cosmic entities about the dangers of engaging with mortal beings. The nightmare she created stands as a monument to betrayal, a reminder of what happens when those who claim to seek knowledge pursue it without wisdom or compassion. For the villagers who died in the massacre and were reborn in the nightmare, there is no comfort in understanding. They did not choose to be involved in the scholars' experiments. They welcomed strangers into their community, shared their sacred traditions, and were repaid with violence and desecration. Their suffering continues unabated, regardless of whether anyone else learns their story. The same is true for Kos and the orphan. Understanding why they were killed does not resurrect them. Acknowledging their pain does not erase it. They remain dead, their potential unrealized, their contributions to the universe ended by human greed and short-sightedness. All that witness can provide is the assurance that their existence mattered, that someone remembers what was lost when they were taken. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the most we can ask from engagement with stories of suffering is that we do not look away, that we honor the victims by refusing to forget them. The Hamlet Massacre cannot be undone, but it can be remembered. The curse cannot be lifted, only contained. The nightmare cannot be emptied, only understood. For those who enter the nightmare seeking something to carry back to the waking world, this understanding is the prize. Not power or transcendence or redemption, but the simple knowledge of what happened and why it matters. The hunter who defeats the orphan and lifts the curse does not become stronger or wiser in any measurable sense. They become someone who knows, someone who has witnessed, someone who will carry the truth forward, regardless of what that truth costs them. In Bloodborne's world, where lies and secrets sustain institutions of tremendous power, this witness carries subversive potential. The healing church's authority depends on concealing the origins of the blood it administers. The hunter's sense of purpose depends on believing they fight against cosmic evil, rather than perpetuating cycles of violence. The citizen's faith in their healers depends on ignorance about what was done to make healing possible. The hunter, who returns from the nightmare, carries the power to undermine all of these comfortable illusions. They know that the blood comes from murdered gods. They know that the hunt perpetuates rather than resolves the crisis. They know that the institutions claiming to protect humanity are built on the bones of innocent victims. This knowledge may not change anything immediately, but it creates the possibility of change in a world that has long resisted acknowledging the truth about itself. Closing thoughts. And so we come to the end of our exploration of the Fishing Hamlet Massacre, Bloodborne's original sin from which all subsequent horror flows. We have walked the blood-soaked shores where Kos breathed her last. We have witnessed the birth and death and rebirth of the orphan. We have stood vigil with Lady Maria and understood why she threw her beloved weapon into darkness. We have traced the connections between that distant tragedy and the present nightmare that consumes Yharnam night after endless night. This story stays with us because it refuses easy categorization. It is not simply a tale of monsters and heroes. It is a story about the consequences of choices made by people who believed they were doing the right thing. The scholars of Byrgenwerth did not set out to commit atrocities. They sought knowledge, understanding, transcendence. But somewhere along the way, they lost sight of the costs they were imposing on others. And by the time they recognized what they had become, it was too late to turn back. The great ones in this telling are not incomprehensible horrors, but tragic figures, beings of immense power and awareness who nonetheless experience pain, loss, and grief. Kos came to the hamlet seeking nothing from its residents except the peace of quiet waters. She gave freely of herself, blessing a community that revered her, asking nothing in return. Her reward was violation, desecration, and death. The curse she pronounced was not arbitrary cosmic malevolence, but the response of a grieving mother to the murder of her child. What remains is silence. The nightmare still exists, though its curse has been lifted. The blood still flows through Yharnam's veins, though its origin is now known. The hunt continues, though its purpose has been questioned. Nothing has been solved, nothing has been fixed, nothing has been redeemed, but something has been witnessed, something has been understood. And perhaps, in a world where darkness seems to triumph without consequence, that understanding represents its own kind of victory. The scholars of Byrgenwerth sought knowledge above all else. They believed that truth was valuable regardless of the cost required to obtain it. In the end, they learned that some costs are too high, that some truths come with prices that can never be paid. The knowledge they gained destroyed them, transformed them, damned them to eternities of punishment in a realm constructed from their victims' grief. We who witness their story from outside can learn from their example. We can pursue understanding without sacrificing compassion. We can seek truth without committing atrocity. We can engage with darkness without becoming dark ourselves. The Hamlet Massacre teaches us that there are lines that should not be crossed, boundaries that protect not just others but ourselves from the consequences of unchecked ambition. The most important lesson may be the simplest one. The villagers of the hamlet did nothing wrong. They lived their lives, practiced their faith, cared for each other in the way that human communities have always done. Their only crime was being present when scholars came looking for cosmic secrets. Their punishment was total destruction, their community erased, their goddess murdered, their descendants transformed into monsters. There is no justice for such victims. No amount of suffering inflicted on the perpetrators can restore what was taken. The best that can be achieved is remembrance, acknowledgement that what happened mattered, and that the people who died deserved better. This is what the player provides in defeating the orphan and lifting the curse. Not redemption, but witness. Not justice, but memory. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will carry some of this with you into your dreams. Not the horror, hopefully, but the understanding, the recognition that even cosmic-scale tragedies have human origins. The awareness that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control. The hope that by remembering what has been lost, we might prevent similar losses in the future. Rest well, fellow hunter. The night is long and full of terrors, but knowledge is its own kind of protection. You now know what happened at the fishing hamlet. You understand why the nightmare exists and what it punishes. You have witnessed the suffering of Kos and her orphan, the guilt of Maria and Yharnam, the consequences of choices made by scholars who believed themselves beyond moral judgment. The story of the hamlet reverberates through every corner of Bloodborne's world. It echoes in the cries of beasts that were once human, It whispers through the blood vials that hunters consume without thinking about their origins. It lurks in the shadows of the healing church, that institution built on foundations of cosmic violence. Nothing in Yharnam is untouched by what happened on that distant shore. Every drop of blood, every transformed creature, every nightmare that haunts the sleeping, all trace their lineage back to that morning when the scholars decided that cosmic knowledge was worth more than cosmic life. But the Hamlet also offers something beyond horror. It offers the possibility of understanding. It shows us that cosmic forces operate according to comprehensible principles, that even great ones have motivations we can recognize. The universe may be vast and terrifying, but it is not entirely alien. Kos loved her child. She grieved when that child was taken from her. She wanted justice, or at least acknowledgement, for the wrong that had been done. These are feelings we can understand, experiences we share despite the immense gulf between human and cosmic consciousness. This knowledge changes nothing and everything. It cannot save those who have already been lost, but it can inform how we approach the challenges that remain. It can guide us toward choices that create rather than destroy, that heal rather than wound, that build bridges between different forms of consciousness, rather than burning those bridges in pursuit of power. The hunters who came before did not have this understanding. They fought in darkness, guided by institutions that deliberately obscured the truth about their origins. They died not knowing why they suffered, not understanding the cosmic forces that manipulated them, not recognizing their role in perpetuating cycles of violence that began before they were born. You are different. You know the story now. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. May you find your worth in the waking world. Good night.